You can use a VPN or virtual private network to connect to your workplace over the internet. A VPN provides for a secure connection through a public network by using authentication and encryption protocols. A VPN is characterized by the authentication protocol that it uses, by the encryption that you use, by the way it encapsulates the information to transport it across the public network. Encapsulation is the concept of embedding the VPN traffic within a piece of traffic that can be passed across a public network. You can use the following VPN protocols. The point-to-point tunneling protocol, or PPTP. This is quite an old protocol now, but it's widely supported. Consider using this if you're troubleshooting and you want to ensure that you can establish a connection, but you're experiencing problems perhaps with some of the more recent protocols. If you can get it to work with PPTP, you know that the infrastructure is in place. The Layer 2 tunneling protocol using IPsec, or L2TP IPsec. The Secure Socket Tunneling Protocol, or SSTP. This is convenient because it uses the same port numbers as are normally opened through a firewall for web access, specifically TCP port 443. The Internet Key Exchange version 2, or IKE-v2 protocol. When you're establishing your connection, you can choose from a number of authentication options. These include PAP, which you should avoid using because it provides for no encryption. It's clear text. CHAP, the Challenge Handshake Authentication Protocol, which is a bit more secure, but still, it's quite an old protocol. MS-CHAP version 2, which you should consider as the minimum level that you should implement for authentication. The Extensible Authentication Protocol, or EAP, and this is probably the most secure way of configuring authentication for a VPN using Windows 10. Typically, from your Windows 10 device, you're going to implement what's known as a remote access VPN as opposed to a site-to-site VPN. In this situation, the VPN client establishes communications to the internet through the internet to a VPN server. So you'll need to configure information on the VPN client about what the IP address or host name of that VPN server is. On the VPN server, you're going to need to configure matching information for the client to connect to. When you use VPN profiles in Windows 10, you can take advantage of a number of advanced features. Always on. You can configure the VPN profile so that the VPN initiates when the user signs in or when there's been a change in the network state, such as no longer being connected to the corporate network. App-triggered VPNs. You can configure the VPN profile to respond to a specific set of apps. If the user loads a particular app, then the VPN will initiate. Traffic filters. With these, your VPN profiles can be configured to initiate only when certain criteria, defined in policies, are met. So for example, you can create app-based rules in which only traffic originating from defined apps can use the VPN. You can also create traffic-based rules that filter based on protocol, address, and TCP port. Finally, Lockdown VPN. You can use this to secure your user's device so that only the VPN can be used for network communications. Let's take a look at what's involved in creating a VPN connection and testing the VPN connection. Before you can set up a VPN connection from your Windows 10 computer, you must have something to connect to. Assuming you're using Windows Server, in this case Windows Server 2016, you'll need to install the Remote Access Server role and optionally the Network Policy and Access Services role. Let's take a look at what each of those does. From Server Manager, I'm going to select Tools and then choose Routing and Remote Access. The Remote Access role supports both routing and direct access and remote access. In this instance, I haven't installed direct access, I've just got the VPN functionality in the Routing and Remote Access console. If I expand this out, you can see via the properties of Routing and Remote Access Local Server that we have enabled IP4 routing and IP4 remote access. Security is not configured here, it's been configured to use a Network Policy and Access Server, so we'll take a look at that in a minute. IP4 settings are to allocate IP addresses from a static pool of addresses on the server here, rather than to use DHCP elsewhere. So when a VPN client connects in, it will be allocated an address from this pool on the remote access server. To gain access using a VPN or other remote access method, you must also be authenticated using a network policy server, which is part of the Network Policy and Access Services role. We can see here that there are some network policies. Network policies define the characteristics and constraints of a remote access attempt. We have a policy here called Connections to Microsoft Routing and Remote Access Server, which is enabled and is configured to grant access. Now the conditions of this are anybody trying to connect from a Microsoft type of device, so the conditions are fairly wide. Pretty much anything can connect. I've enabled this. Normally this is configured for deny access. So in other words, by default, no one can connect remotely to this server. You can create additional policies that are processed in turn based on conditions being met or not met. You can also see down the bottom here some information that pertains to the settings of this policy. So if a remote access attempt meets the conditions of a policy, a network policy, then it must also meet the settings. In this instance, we're specifying the types of protocol and also the authentication methods that are being supported. So when we set up our VPN on the client side, we must make sure we adhere to these particular settings, otherwise we'll be denied access. So on the client computer, we need to set up a VPN connection. We can do that by clicking Settings, Network and Internet, and clicking the VPN tab, and then clicking Add a VPN connection. In the Add a VPN connection window, we must specify a VPN provider. At the moment, the only provider is the built-in Windows one, so I'll select that, but you may be using something from Cisco or some other vendor here. We need to give the connection a name, so let's call it Pearson VPN. And then we need to specify the server name or IP address. That's the remote access server. Now typically this will be on the other side of the internet somewhere, and we must therefore specify a public address that we'll use to connect to it. That must be matching, or that must match the remote access server remote interface address, the internet interface. Now, this is actually a private IP4 address. I'm setting this up in a test environment, but clearly you would require the public IP address or fully qualified domain name of the remote access server. Windows 10 supports a variety of VPN types. By default, it uses the automatic determination method, so it will try each VPN type in order and verify eventually which one of them works on the remote access server. If you know what it is that you want to use, you can choose between PPTP, L2TP with certificate, L2TP with pre-shared key, SSTP or IKE version 2. I'm going to go for PPTP. That's generally easier to set up. How will I sign in? I'll default to a username and password, but we can use certificates or smart cards depending on what's been configured on the server and what's available on the client. We'll use a username and a password. I can enter the username and password here if I want to save it as part of the remote access profile. I'm going to specify that I'll be prompted and it will remember my information. So we can see here that it's set up our VPN connection. We can view some advanced information about that, or we can revisit the configuration. If I click on it here, I've got the option to connect or to look at advanced options. And you can revisit the information that you entered. Here's the name and the IP address of the remote server and so on. And then any proxy settings that you might need to configure. You can also click Change Adapter Options. And that takes you to Control Panel and opens up the Network Connections option. And you can see here there's an iconic representation of the VPN configured for WAN Miniport PPTP. If you want to reconfigure the VPN, you can also do it from here. So we can verify that's the server's host name or IP address. Some options, remember my credentials. On the security page, you can specify curiously the type of the VPN here. You can also specify data encryption It's currently set to optional and connects even if there's no encryption. Again, this characteristic or this property must match up to the same property on the server side. And then what authentication protocols will be used. So I'm going to choose allow these protocols and then specify MS Chat version 2. As long as MS Chat version 2 is one of the supported authentication protocols on the server, I should be in good shape. I can launch the connection from here, or I can switch back over to here and then click connect. I must enter a username and password. Then click OK, and you can see I'm connected. On the server, if we switch back to the server here, we can see what's going on. If we go to Tools and Remote Access Management, click on Operational Status, all looking as if it's working properly. Click on Remote Client Status, and we can see that there is a username, Warren AJ, in the domain Pearson has connected. They've been given an allocated address of 10.00.50. They've been up for about a minute using the PPTP protocol. Get some more details here if I want to. Authentication method is MS Chat version 2. I can use this option over on the right here to disconnect all the VPN clients. You can also use the routing and remote access console. If we expand out the local server and take a look at ports, scroll down the list of ports, there are a lot of them. We should see one that's active somewhere. Oh, must have missed it. Oh, there we go. Buried away there. There's a WAN miniport PPTP active. And if we click on the Remote Access Clients tab here, you can also see the same client we looked at in the other console. I can disconnect it or view the status from here as well. So back on the client, all that remains is for me to disconnect the VPN and close down the network connections. In the demonstration, you saw how to create a VPN connection and how to test that connection.